Welcome to the Inclusive Growth Show with Toby Milden. Future-proofing your business by creating a diverse workplace.
Hey there, thank you ever so much for tuning into this episode of the Inclusive Growth Podcast. I am Toby Milden, and today I'm joined by Andy Nisovic, and Andy and I will be talking a lot about implicit biases. And Andy has got a really great and interesting career, and you'll learn from him and how the topic of implicit bias has come up in his career and how he now talks about implicit bias with his own clients. So before we dive into the questions, Andy, lovely to see you. Would you mind just introducing yourself a bit more, letting the person know listening to us right now a bit about your background and what you do?
Sure. Thanks ever so much for having us on, Toby. As Toby said, my name's Andy Nisovic, and I'm the founder and director of a company called One Degree Training and Coaching. We specialise in leadership development to encourage and create a culture of leadership. So rather than having a mixed bag of skills, that leadership becomes something that's grown from the bottom up, and it becomes the everyday lived experience. Prior to starting the company back in October last year, I was in the Air Force for 23 years. I joined up at the young age of 19, young, naive, ambitious, not really knowing what the world was all about. And I learned some great lessons. I learned some harsh lessons, as everyone in any walk of life does. And it was a fantastic career. The last few years, I was teaching the RAF's leadership and management courses, and it was hands down the best job I've ever had, which, ironically, loving my job so much is what caused me to want to leave, because I found my place in the world, and it was delivering this kind of training to people, which I love.
Andy, that sounds brilliant, and really interesting career at the RAF and how that's now informing your current work around leadership development. So, I mean, the main topic of today's conversation is around implicit bias. So let's just start with the basics. So what is bias and why do we have these biases?
I will just caveat that I'm not an academic, so I'm not going to be able to give you an academic answer to or definition of what a bias is. But in very, very simple terms, a bias is a perception of the world. And that all it is very, very simply, that can be a negative perception or a positive perception. It's just because of the experiences that we've got, we perceive the world based on those experiences, and we will skew reality dependent on how we interpret the current situation.
That's really good. One of my diversity and inclusion heroes is Verna Myers, who is now the head of diversity and inclusion for Netflix. She lives over in America. She's a lawyer by background. And she's done a really great TED Talk about biases. And she says that biases are the stories that we make up about people before we get to know them. And I just think that's such a great way of putting it, because it's an academic topic that has been studied extensively, particularly for the last decade. So there are those academic definitions out there, but I just like the simplicity and the accessibility of how Verna put it.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that.
So how do biases occur then?
Very simply, based on our backgrounds, between the ages of 2 and 7, we are very much subjected to the ideas, the opinions, the beliefs of other people. And quite often, like for example, I'm in my 40s, people of our generation, we're still, in some ways, still suffering really because of the biased beliefs that our parents, our grandparents subjected us to and made us believe were true as we were growing up. And obviously, as we grow up, we develop our own intelligence, our own perception of the world. However, because those external beliefs have been pushed into us from such a young age, they become part of our core beliefs. And it's that deep level stuff that really affects our bias because it exists within the subconscious. So we don't have any control over it. So, yeah, but then there's more conscious ways of creating biases. So, for example, if you were let's say, an academic student, and you were picked on by the more sporty types. I think that's a very biased way of stereotyping bullying in school place, isn't it? But let's say that was your lived experience. Then as you grow up, because you were treated badly by people of a certain type, of a certain demographic, i.e. sporty, athletic people, you might have a negative feeling towards athletic people as an adult. So as you interact with those around you, as you meet new people, you see somebody coming up who looks like they work out, looks like they're quite sporty, you might straight away have those defences.
Yeah.
There are many, many other examples. So, for example, if you belonged to a certain race and you were bullied by a certain other race, you would potentially have defensive reactions to those people. If there was a certain demographic of society as you were growing up that, let's say in my personal circumstances when I was growing up, there was one particular group of people who you actively avoided in the estates where I grew up if you saw them, because 90% of the street crime in the estate was carried out by one certain group of people. So then that becomes a defensive reaction that we take forwards, so that subconsciously, if we see somebody who looks like that person, our subconscious puts those defensive barriers up straight away.
Yeah. Which is like that saying from Werner Myers, it's the stories that we make up about people before we get to know them.
Yeah, the exact opposite is true as well when it comes to biases, because the reason that we have bias is one, to protect us, but it's also then to help us create great relationships with people. So if there's a certain type of person who you got on with brilliantly when you're at school, then you're going to have positive biases towards those kind of people. If there's a certain type of person that was a hugely positive influence on you as you were growing up, then again, somebody who looks like that or carries themselves in a similar sort of way, then you're going to naturally gravitate towards them. So there are positive aspects to bias as well. And I think that's what people often forget, is that having a bias is not the same as being a discriminant.
Yeah. Malcolm Gladwell in his book says that biases can help us in some situations and they can hinder us in others. And I think that's a really interesting point. And as a leader, I suppose it's important to understand when biases are being a hindrance. So if you're in a position of responsibility where you're deciding who gets a promotion, if you're promoting somebody in your own image, if your natural tendency is to associate with a certain type of person and they're more likely to get promoted, then that actually might work against other people.
From my experience developing leaders, it's quite common that you'll see people who are promoted who are in the same sort of mold as their bosses.
Yeah.
It's not because necessarily they're consciously favouring those people, but their managers have got a positive bias. So it's not conscious thoughts. They're not necessarily applying conscious activities to it. It's all in the subconscious where you're seeing the reasons to promote somebody rather than the reasons not to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see this a lot with my clients where they're concerned about a lack of diversity at the senior levels of an organization. And they're really concerned about groupthink and the fact that they've got a leadership team that are from similar backgrounds, thinking along similar lines, and therefore they're missing out on creativity, innovation, more well-rounded decision-making and that kind of thing.
And it can do that. That is one of the dangers of positive bias. Obviously, one of them, the obvious one, is other people's perception that it is discrimination. So either positive discrimination for the people who are getting promoted or negative discrimination against the people who aren't getting promoted. But often it's not that simple. It's far more complicated. There's deep psychology behind how bias works and how it affects the way that we think and what we see in certain people and what we don't see in other people. But yeah, that groupthink is an incredibly dangerous thing within the business sense, because if everybody is making the same decisions, if everybody is acting in the same way, then there's no ability to react when something different happens. Because
Absolutely.
There's that different perspectives, those new ideas that need to come in within the modern changing world.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously you work with leaders in your day-to-day work. What are some of the other risks of ignoring our implicit biases?
The number one risk is how other people perceive it. So there have been a number of diversity and inclusion cases that I've been indirectly aware of over the years. And a very, very common feature is one person will think they're being discriminated against, and the other person categorically and quite aggressively denies it, taking offence that they could be deemed as being discriminate. Whereas actually both people are right. And this is what I mean, it's not simple. There's deep level psychology that goes on here. Both people are right, because the person who has perceived that they are being discriminated against, from their perspective, they are.
Yeah.
But from the person who is defending themselves in this situation, they haven't acted with discrimination. They've just acted according to their own biases. And this is all going on in the subconscious. So they're not aware of the impacts that they're having on other people.
Yeah. And that's why we call it unconscious bias, because it's these kind of implicit biases that are happening in the other than consciousness.
Yeah.
I like what you were saying about it's our kind of perspectives through experience. One of my favorite sayings when I talk about unconscious bias is that we falsely think that we accurately see the world, and then we make decisions based on what we falsely think is true.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a mind bender, but I've done enough training now that I've said it so many times that it's just ingrained in me. But it's, we falsely think that we accurately see the world, and then we make decisions based on what we falsely think is true.
You just reminded me of a book that I'm reading at the moment. I can't remember the name of the author, but the title of the book is "You're Not as Smart as You Think You Are."
Oh, that's a good one.
And he refers to a bit of research that says that every single human being has a physical blind spot, more or less front and centre of your vision. But we don't perceive it because, based on our experiences and our knowledge, our brain does what it's designed to do, and it just fills in the blank. So we're not aware of this. But the easiest way that I found to contextualize it is when those times when you walk down a street and all of a sudden somebody appears out of nowhere, and they say they've been trying to wave at you and get your attention for the last couple of minutes, and you just haven't been aware. But that's because they've been within that blind spot, and your brain wasn't expecting them to be there, so they've just kind of filled in the blanks over the top. So it happens within our vision, but it also happens within our understanding of the world. There is only so much data that our brains can process.
Yeah, there's a really great video, and you can get it on YouTube, and I've used it in training, where on the screen are people wearing white T-shirts and black T-shirts.
Yes.
And the voiceover says, you're going to watch a 30-second clip. Try and count as many people wearing white T-shirts as possible. So you're sat there watching this video and you're trying to count the number of people wearing a white T-shirt. And then it pauses, and then the voiceover artist says, but did you see the dancing bear? And you're like, what dancing bear? And he goes, watch it again. And they replay the video, and then there's this bear that does like a moonwalk across the screen. And I think that's what you were talking about. You're so focused on trying to count the number of people wearing a white T-shirt that you miss the moonwalking bear.
Right there, right in front and centre of vision. There is a similar one that the study was counts the number of passes between players on a football pitch, and a gorilla just walks across, or a bloke in a gorilla's suit walks across the screen. Less than half of the people taking part in the study saw this gorilla that was right in front of them.
If your company has a great diversity and inclusion strategy, if your organisation has an amazing work culture where productivity is peaking, if the best talent in your industry are working for you, if all your employees are happy and feel included, then feel free to skip this message for about 30 seconds and continue listening to the podcast interview with Toby. But if you feel that your company is lacking in any one of these areas, your employer reputation is taking a hit. Toby Milden is one of the UK's leading diversity and inclusion experts, who has helped top companies like Deloitte, the BBC, Sony Pictures and Centrica, as well as numerous scale-up businesses who want an outstanding inclusive culture. To go further in your diversity and inclusion journey, log on to Toby's webinar at www.milden.co.uk/free-webinar to accelerate your company's diversity and inclusion strategy in 40 minutes. Thanks for listening. And now back to the podcast interview with Toby.
Biases and being aware of your blind spots is one area of being an inclusive leader. And it is something that Deloitte talk about in their 6 signature traits of inclusive leadership. But I do know that the other thing that you talk about is the danger of ego as a leader, or the importance of humility in being an inclusive leader. What more can you say about that?
So ego is something that everybody has. So in the same way that everybody has biases, everybody has ego. Again, I'm not an academic, so I won't go into the full science of it, mainly because I don't know it fully. But there's 3 aspects of the psyche. There's the ego, the superego, and the id. The id being the calm and sensible and kind of the boring one that keeps you safe and everything. The superego being that absolutely catastrophic mess of a person who just wants to go and throw themselves out of an aeroplane and who cares about a parachute? We don't need that. and the ego that is still risk averse, but a little less. But it is kind of your sense of superiority and that sense of righteousness that we have. When we operate purely within ego, what we're doing is we're concentrating on ourselves, what our needs are, whether we're right or wrong, what our opinions are. There is nothing better to disconnect us from the people that we're responsible for or the people that we're working with than operating within ego. We need every aspect of that psyche. If we didn't have that superego, we would never take any risks at all. We would never have any fun because the id would just keep us safe and boring and within a locked room. If we didn't have the ego, we'd never stretch ourselves. We'd never kind of really push our point of view and allow ourselves to be heard. If we didn't have that id, then we would just be jumping out of a plane with no parachute. So we need all aspects of the psyche, including the ego. But if we only operate within the ego, then we're just disconnecting because we don't allow ourselves to hear other people's ideas, other people's opinions and thoughts. It's all just about us. That's why we need to balance out everything, let our ego go. Quite often, a big mistake that leaders make is they tell people to do something or what they should be doing. And I know this is a podcast, so they should in inverted commas. And whereas actually what we need to be doing as leaders is we need to ask questions. Because when we ask questions, we allow other people to be themselves, to bring up there. So we as leaders, we can then learn more about that person, learn more about where their strengths are, what their capabilities are, what their potential is, but also then the areas that they need a little bit of development in and where we can then support them. When we operate from ego, we don't allow ourselves to ask the questions. It's just constant tell. You should be doing this, you should be doing that. And as Professor Steve Peters once said on a talk I heard him give, is that should is probably one of the most dangerous words in the English language.
It is.
Because it comes from bias, it comes from assumption, but guarantees absolutely nothing.
Yeah, I learned that when I was training to be an executive coach. They said keep an eye out for the should words. Yeah. If somebody says, "Oh, I should be doing this," or "I should be doing that," then that's a good word to look out for.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've talked about how our implicit biases can positively or negatively impact our decision making. We've talked about the role of ego as a leader. If the person listening to us today wants to be a more inclusive leader, they want to be more aware of their biases or their blind spots, they want to be more curious, they want to have more humility? What's your advice to them?
So the biggest lesson that I learned, unfortunately far too late in life, was that actually we as individuals are probably the last person to know what's best for us. We like to think that we're self-aware, but actually we're not. We very often don't allow ourselves to be truly honest with ourselves. And that's another part of the psyche that prevents us from doing that. I mentioned Steve Peters earlier, his chimp paradox, that chimp brain within you doesn't like to be wrong. So it will create all sorts of havoc and excuses and chaos in order to stop you really delving deep into yourself. So whatever you can do to raise your self-awareness is the number one piece of advice that I would really encourage, not just leaders, not just people with leadership responsibility, but everyone to do, because there are loads and loads of assessments that you can do, some paid for, some free, and obviously the free ones you take with a pinch of salt, because they're quite often they're lead magnets to try and get you to buy something. But what the free ones do give you is an awareness of where you might have some biases. It's not that you do, but where you might. When we can be aware of where our biases are, then we can challenge ourselves and we can slow our decision making down. So let's say we use the example promoting somebody again. We can ask ourselves questions such as, what evidence have I got that tells me that person A is a better candidate than person B, rather than just having that feeling. Because if it's a feeling, good chance that that's coming from bias.
Yeah, one of the famous books around unconscious bias is Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He talks about system 1 and system 2 thinking. And if you're going with your kind of intuition and your gut reaction, you're probably going with your system 1 thinking, which is rife with bias.
Yeah, I mean, when there are times where decision making needs to be rapid, and quite often your gut feeling will steer you right about 80% of the time. It's the whole Pareto principle, isn't it? Generally, about 80% of the time, that gut feeling will steer you in the right direction. But where there is time to really think about, and when you're promoting somebody, let's face it, you're not going to promote somebody on a whim, are you? There's going to be lots of process to it.
Yeah,
so that's where you can really sit and analyse and think, right, what evidence have I got? Where have they shown that they're an expert in their current field? What leadership qualities have they shown? Where have they shown that they're able to listen to people, to hear other people, and create an environment that everybody feels able to own their own voice, but also to grow and develop within the team? Because obviously there's a lot more to leadership than just being good at your job.
Yeah, I like what you said about your intuition being true 80% of the time, because in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, I do remember he tells a story about a firefighter in New York going into a burning building, and the firefighter thought that the fire wasn't behaving in the way that it should behave.
Yeah.
Everybody thought, or it was reported, that the fire was coming from the kitchen, but his instinct was to tell his crew to get out of the building as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And just as he did, the floor collapsed and the fire was coming from the basement.
Wow.
And he was, I suppose, in the words of Daniel Kahneman, he was using his system 1 thinking.
Yeah.
You don't want to overthink those kind of situations. You probably do want to go with your hunches.
No, I'm sure you can use your imagination. There's been some instances in my career where I can't sit down and have a committee to make a decision about something. It's very much that directive, authoritarian style of leadership would just go and do it in a lot less diplomatic way. But sometimes that's needed when time is of the essence, and you don't just have to be in the military or a firefighter or a policeman to have that need.
Absolutely.
But where the opportunity comes, ask yourself the questions, and that will help you slow yourself down and significantly reduce your risk of acting in a way that other people would perceive as discriminate.
Yeah, slowing down is a really good tip, because often we are prone to biases when we are working under pressure to tight deadlines and we're under high cognitive load or stress, in other words. So it's easier said than done in some situations, but the ability to just slow down your thinking does help a lot. The penultimate question that I ask everybody when they come on this podcast is, what does inclusive growth mean to you?
It's a great question. And you know what? Since you emailed me a couple of weeks ago to tell me that this is a question you've been out, I've tried to think of a really smart answer to give that's going to make your audience go, yeah, good point, well done. You know what? I just love the give it a little kiss principle. Keep it simple, Sherlock. And inclusive growth to me just means everybody knows something you don't. That's one of the core values of my business. Everybody knows something that I don't. So inclusivity just means that ability to hear perspectives, ideas, thoughts, opinions from anywhere. There's a great example I can give you of where great ideas can come from absolutely anywhere. So several years ago, I was a combat-ready trainer in the Air Force. We were on exercise, and the mission went completely wrong. Anything you could think of to go wrong, it went wrong, and all of the positions were filled by trainees. So they were qualified people, but trainees in the combat ready side of things. And all of the instructors were people similar to me, 20-ish years of experience doing the job, and we're all doing what we're supposed to do, trying to draw the ideas of how to solve it. It was like trying to draw blood from a stone. And there was this young one lad who'd been in the military 12 to 18 months, something like that, and a little bit cocky, one of those good fun people, but yeah, just one of those just add alcohol idiot type characters. I can't remember what he said, but he just piped up with an idea and just said, why don't we just do this? And it was something about the way that we share information around the ops room. And all of us instructors, I say easily 20 years average experience for each person, our chins just hit the floor thinking, in all the years that we've been doing this, why have we never thought of this? Because it was so easy. That one tiny little change, the next mission, everything went perfectly. And this was for somebody that nobody had a massive deal of respect for at the time. Everyone liked him, but he was one of these people that if there was ever any trouble, not necessarily a troublemaker, but one of the people involved. So nobody had a massive amount of respect for him as an operator, but his one idea just completely solved all the problems that we'd had.
That's brilliant. And as leaders, you were open to hearing that idea, which I think is also testament to inclusive leadership.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if the person listening to us right now wants to get in touch with you, maybe they want to pick your brains about leadership in their own organization, how should they do that?
LinkedIn is probably the easiest way. Fortunately, my surname isn't that usual, isn't that common. So Andy Nisovich, N for November, I, S for Sierra, EVIC, and I'll give you a link to stick in the comments part for the podcast. Yeah, connect with me on there, and any questions you've got, I'm quite happy to be challenged on anything that I've said, because everybody knows something I don't. Or to just have some good, honest conversations. And if there's any help I can give anybody, I'll be delighted to.
Brilliant. Well, Andy, thanks for taking time out of your busy day to have a chat with me and share your knowledge with the person listening to us right now. We've covered a lot. We've talked about what biases are, where they come from, how they occur, what we could do about them, the risks of ignoring our implicit biases, the danger of ego as a leader, and the importance of practicing leadership with humility. So, Andy, thanks ever so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
And thank you for tuning into this episode of today's Inclusive Growth podcast. Hopefully you've taken away some interesting information about implicit bias and the role that it has on our decision making and on creating inclusive cultures within your own organization. Like we say, if you do want any assistance with this, please do reach out to me and my team. Our website is www.milden.co.uk. We would be happy to chat with you, and also connect with Andy on LinkedIn. He'll be very happy to take any questions that you have about leadership in your own organization. We have another episode of the Inclusive Growth podcast, which will be coming up very soon. Until then, take good care of yourself. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Inclusive Growth Show. For further information and resources from Toby and his team, head on over to our website at milden.co.uk